An investigation begins. How can they make this go away? The devaluation of Colin's life and rights reaches a new low. As we prepare ourselves to look into the upcoming investigation, we need to consider the roles of the three main groups involved: the pathology, the fiscal, and the police. There are sound reasons why this investigation should have been completely independent. Regardless of blame, we are today very aware of the term unconscious bias. Despite the fiscal and police being aware of their obligation to an independent and impartial investigation, why was it okay to refuse one? And what motivation lay behind this? Regardless of Colin's family's concerns and these conflicts, the investigation was to begin. The investigation into Colin's death was to be called Operation Shrew. The first witness interviewed was on the 11th of November 2008. In just 7 days' time, we see a major problem developing. On the 18th of November, the senior investigating officer in Operation Shrew interviews the officer at the heart of the failings on the night of Colin's death. This was a junior rank interviewing a more senior rank. The risk is that hierarchy, comradeship, etc. can lead to the blurring of expectation. We must also consider that this officer had something to hide because of the failings of the night. And again, these failings are known by the senior officers in Fife Police. Only 2 days later, the investigating officer debriefs his team with his understanding of the case. How influential was the meeting on the 18th of November? This can only be gauged when we look at the actions taken through Operation Shrew. The method Fife Police were using to update the Fiscal's office was the use of STREP reports. This summarises what the investigating officer believes are the key points of the investigation to date. They're also passed to experts to help them form an opinion. Each STREP report is additive to the previous STREP report and should be read in conjunction with them rather than in isolation. It is the analysis of these reports that will be the focus of how we see Fife Police manage this investigation. Very often, it is not what's in, but what's left out that concerns us. The basic flow in this STREP covers the timeline as we had shown in Film 1. But it is already disconcerting that we see comments by Candace being taken as fact and corroborated when not so. We also see the omission of Colin's brother and mother's statements. They had this information in 2007 and repeated in statements before this STREP, but not included. There is also no mention of the partially packed suitcase or clothes on the bed. Already, the true picture is being distorted. An important point that was covered, however, was the wound to Colin's head. They have a handbag and want to check against the wound. We will see how this plays out in the coming months. This review starts to give an insight into the personal lives of Colin and Candace. It's clear that Colin had been unfaithful. We see that both the parties took drugs. It states that Candace took hers recreationally and Colin took occasionally. We need to stay aware of how Colin's drug use is described as we progress. It is mentioned that Colin's friend is a drug dealer, but it's not mentioned that Candace was actually in his house the night before Colin's death. Candace had previously stated that Colin hadn't eaten for 2 days, and yet the individual who saw Colin leave at 5:30 that day also had lunch with him that day. Also, the fact that Candace said she had slapped Colin before for having an affair seems to be the emphasis on Colin having an affair before, but not considering equally that this is evidence of Candace also having assaulted Colin before. The comment that states Colin said his life is not worth living will be examined later as part of a broader point. We also see that this is the first time as part of an actual investigation that any pathologist had said it was suspicious. Again, on the surface, this seems like a balanced report this time, but you have to look deeper to understand some of the significance of the comments. We see that Colin's drug taking has been moved from occasionally to using drugs regularly. The only new statements taken only talk of recreational use of drugs, so what justifies this change of emphasis? As we go on, we will see that the authorities tried to use Colin's drug taking as an explanation how someone could self-inflict when they're not suicidal. And why would the police try to hide all the negative comments about Candace? None of these would point to her being homicidal in any way, but what this does, it ensures that all the negatives are only pointing at one person. Meanwhile, in the background, as the investigation is ongoing, Colin's family met with a chief superintendent at Kirkcaldy Police Station on a couple of occasions in November and December. Among a broad range of areas covered, this officer stated something that was very troubling. As this story develops, you'll see this is at the front and centre of how they tried to make this case go away. He talked of the knife wound, and he stated that it wouldn't take much force to do this, as the wound was to the side of the sternum, and he said he had 2 previous cases like this. Where did this come from? We had seen pathology, ambulance, police reports, and we've even seen the pathologist's police statement, and they all say the wound was through the sternum. The post-mortem says it's through the midline of the central chest. So how can the police offer this different scenario? This repositioning of the wound has to be taken into consideration, along with the way in which the circumstantial information is being heavily weighted against Colin. On the 28th of November, we wrote asking for more information on these 2 cases as reported by the Chief Superintendent. This reply on the 15th of December states that this information would not be shared. The next piece of information we receive is from the Fiscal's office that was sent on the 7th of January 2009. It's informing us that the police think that a full report will be available towards the end of January 2009. That means the investigation is drawing to a close. It's imperative to understand how this system works. At this stage, all the Fiscal sees is what is written in a STREP report. We have already seen how in this case these are being distorted. If the police say it's suicide, then the Fiscal only has to review the statements and concur with this decision. So what kind of statements were being shared in this case? We get our best insight by looking at the package sent to Dundee pathologists on January the 23rd, 2009. We see within this package that the 3 situational reports that are included. The witness statements shared will talk to Colin's infidelity, drug taking and suggestion he could not live without Candace. All of the already highlighted items are still missing. We need to bear in mind that the police say themselves that these packages were to help the experts make up their minds. In their own internal investigation from November 2008, Fife police were critical of failure to do door-to-door inquiries on the night of Colin's death. It is even written in their standard protocol, and yet here we are, the 3rd time they should investigate Colin's death, there are no door-to-door inquiries. They hadn't even interviewed the neighbour diagonally upstairs from Colin in the block of 4. They hadn't interviewed Candace's mother or father, whom she said she had been talking to before she left, and they hadn't interviewed their uncle who was first on the scene. And yet the investigation has been closed. Most of what has been shared to date was unknown to us at this time. In early February 2009, we had cause for concern after some dialogue with the investigating inspector. We called for a meeting with the Fiscal. This situation report would prove to be the basis for our Fiscal meeting in later February. In this report, there is again the focus on Colin's drug taking and his emotional state. They suggest that he regularly takes cocaine and is in emotional turmoil. They cite two people, one his boss who had to have a one-to-one because of his state, and Candace's friend who it is claimed said Colin had said he could not live without Candace. The reality of what was said was very different. His boss actually said that they had a one-to-one as usual. At the FBI, Candace's friend actually repudiated any suggestion Colin was at risk if he made this comment. So what comments did the police have regarding Colin's drug-taking and emotional state? In the statements collected at this point, there is a greater emphasis that Colin took ecstasy, but did occasionally take cocaine. The positive aspect is that the situation reports from the police states just this, that Colin occasionally took cocaine. So what new statements now emerge that inform the police that Colin is not an occasional user of cocaine, but a regular user? In fact, they only have 4 new statements, and nothing said by these individuals should have changed the status of Colin's drug taking. The police actually cite 2 witnesses that say Colin regularly used cocaine, but this is blatantly untrue, as those witnesses never said such a thing. As we will go on to see, this exaggeration of Colin's drug taking will increase right through to the FBI and under oath. We will see that the same distortions of findings can be found in how Colin's frame of mind is distorted. From the Saturday that Candace left him, we have 12 people that saw him. Only 1 said he was anxious, the rest said he was fine. And we see that his boss had said that they had the one-to-one as normal and he was fine. How can a police officer then turn that into something far, far different? So there is no emotional turmoil, there are no excessive drugs. But we need to remember, the fiscal doesn't look at all these statements, only those the police give and the summary reports. We see that not only are the negatives about Colin dramatically exaggerated, we will also see that the negatives about Candace are seriously underplayed and actively suppressed. We see that by the time the 4th situation report is finished in February 2009, Fife police had 11 statements with 21 negative aspects of Candace's behaviour. Some of this pertained to violence to Colin. Yet in the Fife police situation report, they say they only had 2 negative words about Candace Bonner. From these statements, we see that the individual detective constables have done their job and collected appropriate statements. It is the senior officers that are corrupting this evidence. We do not believe this is about protecting Candace Bonner. It is about framing Colin and thus hiding the mistakes and the cover-up that went before.
At some stage, I'm not sure when it was, but at some stage the fiscal has said, worse to the effect of, if you cannot prove it's self-inflicted, it stays as a homicide because they made such a mess of it. They know that. And that's going to be really damaging to the individuals in the force and to the force's reputation. If it can prove it's a suicide, the problem goes away. No surprise. The police officers who work for the bosses who made the mistakes are now investigating their bosses. So they're middle ranking and junior officers who were expected to investigate a crime which their bosses said was never a crime and we've abandoned it and there's been all the flack. Now that puts them under intolerable pressure to not embarrass their bosses and the force, but satisfy the needs of the fiscal. And I think what happened was, and looking at particularly the summaries of statements, in an effort to show that this was suicide, statements made by witnesses about Colin's behaviour and his attitude and his conduct in the weeks prior to his death are selectively edited.